Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us here today for the fifth First Nation Infrastructure Institute webinar. My name is Jason Calla, and I'm pleased to be here with you today to talk about infrastructure and shovel-ready projects. Today, we're going to be talking about a common challenge we've heard with respect to infrastructure projects, and that's getting your project funded. I'm really looking forward to the discussion today, since we're going to be joined by panelists that know these challenges well and know how to overcome these challenges and have worked with nations to support them using the tools of the First Nations Fiscal Management Act. I think everyone's joined now from the waiting room, and I think we can get started. But before we do, I do want to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the shared territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. Happy to see everyone that's been able to join us here today from your respective territories. To start this webinar in a good way, I'd like to introduce Alan Claxton. Alan's serving as the First Nation Infrastructure Institute Development Board Chair. And Alan has a lot of experience. In fact, he has a lot of experience with this exact problem of how to get your project funded in his time serving his community as chief and as counselor. So, again, Alan, congratulations are in order, because I understand you welcomed a new grandson to the world just a couple of days ago. How are you feeling about that today?
Well, I'm very excited. It's been quite an eventful week for me already. On Monday evening, I got my COVID shot. I had a really sore arm overnight and all the next day, and felt extremely tired all the next day. But yesterday I felt great, and today I feel great again. So I'm excited about having that done, like you are for your dad. It sounds like our whole community got completed this week.
That grant's on the top of that room.
Great news. And the grandson, we're going to go see him tonight. We're going to bring over a care package of sandwiches and snacks and everything else to help them through this first week. And very excited about that. And also excited about this webinar today. I'd like to acknowledge all the territories that are involved in this webinar today, and encourage us to continue to work together and work forward with each other, supporting each other, and remember the ones that are going through a hard time with COVID. There's some lonely people out there. The weather's finally getting nicer, so they can at least get outside and get some exercise and perhaps see some people through social distancing, and talking about getting your project funded. I know that we wouldn't have had our new gymnasium and administration and health office if it hadn't have been for the institutions. We used the First Nation Tax Commission and the fiscal realities to fund that $10 million project. We did have another bigger project with a big box mall, and that would have included the institutions as well for financing. But that died when the big box industry died, and I just know that with the support of our institutions, our communities can move forward and get more done if they do implement these institutions. And with that, Jason, I think we should just get right into it and get this presentation done for the people that are there. And thank you for participating today, HCM. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much, Alan. Again, welcome to all of you now who have joined to this fifth of five in our Shovel Ready webinar series. In the first four webinars, we talked a lot about the work needed to get projects shovel ready. And we talked actually, what does shovel ready mean? And about the term, and we hear it a lot, maybe in the news, because we're in an economic downturn, and during these economic downturn times, often there are investments made into infrastructure projects because it's viewed as a way to encourage economic development and encourage a recovery from the downturn. And when investments are made, often people are looking for projects that they call shovel ready. And that means all the due diligence has been done. The planning work has been done to get the projects so that they're ready for construction. And this type of planning and due diligence work is exactly the kind of thing that we're thinking a lot about with the First Nation Infrastructure Institute. That's what are all the steps and what are all the pieces of work that need to be done to get a project ready. We know there's a big infrastructure gap in Indigenous communities, and we think that some support to communities that are interested to get their projects ready will help reduce the gap. We talked a bit about business cases. We talked about the financial part of the business case, which is putting a financial plan together. That's really thinking about what are the costs associated with your project, not only to build it, but also to operate and maintain it through its life cycle. And then also, what are the revenues that you can use to help pay for those costs? And the tricky part is matching them up at the right time period. Sometimes the revenues that you're going to get in aren't at the time when the costs come. And so you have to use these different tools to be able to match up the timing of these things. And that's actually exactly what a lot of the tools in the First Nations Fiscal Management Act are about. So I do have I'm going to share screen here, a couple of slides to talk a little bit about the Fiscal Management Act. And again, today we're fortunate to be joined by some panelists. Jody Anderson from the First Nations Finance Authority, Scott Munro from the First Nations Financial Management Board, and Trenton Paul from the First Nation Tax Commission. These are three organizations that are established by the First Nations Fiscal Management Act. That's hopefully showing up in a slide on your screen there. And the idea behind FINI is to be a complementary institute that would work collaboratively with the others to provide support to Indigenous groups, to First Nations that choose to use these tools. It's optional in nature. And today we're going to think about how sometimes there's confusion about the roles and responsibilities of these organizations. There's a lot of acronyms and all of the things that we hear about. And so it can be a bit confusing, but I think, we're fortunate to be joined by people who understand these roles and responsibilities very well today. Jody Anderson from FNFA is going to talk to you about how the FNFA can help finance your project. Scott Munro from the First Nations Financial Management Board is going to talk about how the FMB certification can make you and your project more attractive to lenders. And Trenton Paul from the First Nations Tax Commission is going to talk about how to generate revenues for your project to finance it over the long term. And again, Jody, Scott, and Trenton have experience working with different groups to overcome the challenges and use these tools to get a project funded. At the end, I'm going to come back and talk a little bit about how FINI can work with the institutions and with Indigenous groups to support the planning. So I'm going to stop talking now, and I'm going to welcome Jody Anderson to say a few words. Jody is the Associate Director of Member Services for the First Nations Finance Authority. Previous to that, she did some work with the Aboriginal Financial Officers Association, and Jody's coming to us from Ottawa today. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen here and say welcome to Jody.
Thank you, Jason. And Ani Boujou, Jody Anderson, Indigenous Cause, Kuchaching and Dojaba, Ottawa, Ninda. I bring greetings today from the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin people. However, I was born and raised in northwestern Ontario, a very small community. Still living and working in Ottawa with my family now, but I'm really loving the work that I do and serving communities right across Canada. I've been fortunate enough to do that for well over 20 years now, and I hope to continue doing that, and especially working with the FNFA, because I see such progress being made and a ton of success stories that are coming out as a result of the tools from the Fiscal Management Act. And so it's a pleasure for me to be here today. Congratulations, Alan, on the birth of your grandson, and thank you for welcoming us. And it's really nice to see some other women on this panel. Usually when we talk about infrastructure, it's usually dominated by gentlemen. So Ani, welcome, and it's nice to see your faces. So I'm up for a great discussion today. We've had some preliminary discussions, and I'm sure that we could go on beyond an hour, and there's a lot of great questions that are really coming in from right across Canada, large communities, small communities, and questions about the FNFA, questions about what we do, how things work, you name it. So I would be more than happy to take questions throughout the discussion. And by all means, I didn't come today with a presentation, but I'm happy to connect with people beyond this panel. But really what I wanted to talk about was the piece that FNFA brings to this puzzle in terms of, where do we start? What pieces do we need? When do we have to bring certain pieces in at what point? And Jason alluded to it earlier that there's all of these acronyms that we talk about. And, certainly when you're learning about FINI or FMB or FNFA, it can get confusing at times. So I'm glad that these discussions are happening and clarification, and it may require, us to repeat that over and over again, and that's okay. But really the institutions work independent of each other, but we work in unison, or we collaborate together so that all First Nations can work in parallel and get things done at their pace. So we know that there's these massive infrastructure gaps within First Nations across Canada. We know that there is a $30 billion infrastructure gap that currently exists. And the question is, how are we going to close that gap? And so the current pay-as-you-go system that we are working with right now just isn't working. And if we continue on that system, we're never going to close that gap. In fact, the gap is going to widen and widen. So these tools are really an outside of the box. We have to think differently. We have to think progressively in terms of how are we going to finance and find money to get these projects done. And so that's really one of the reasons, or one of the premises, that the FNFA was created. We were created to act as a treasury board, acting as a treasury function specifically for chief and council, specifically for First Nations. So you want to build a new band office, you want to get road and sewer and wastewater brought into your community. We can provide financing options for you, for communities, at rates that are extremely low, because access to capital was one of the barriers that Jason was talking about earlier. So prior to the FNFA being on the scene, First Nations always had to go down to their local bank and try and get a loan. If they were successful at getting those loans, oftentimes the rates were quite high because the First Nation communities were treated as entities or business or commercial entities. So we can help level that playing field, because if you talk about communities like, or cities like Ottawa or Vancouver, or even smaller communities, whatever, Sulikout, they don't go down to the local banks to borrow for infrastructure. They borrow through a financing authority, and that's what we want, and that's what we are to First Nations. And we also want to become the lender of choice for First Nations when you're looking at infrastructure. Does that kind of answer your question, Jason, when we're talking about what we do and how do we support and financing? I mean, I want to give other people an opportunity to speak as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Jody. I really appreciate that start. And like you say, there's a lot of support out there. We've heard even in recent webinars is, geez, even with the support, where do we start? And how do we, we know maybe our community has in mind certain projects. I see Barb, Tom, attending from Cheslata. Welcome, Barb. And I know Cheslata well. They're, have some objectives from their comprehensive community plan, like, for example, a community center and some infrastructure like water and sewer for some additional homes. And they're starting to use the tools, right? Starting to develop a financial administration law and think through, and maybe this is a good segue to pass over to Scott a little bit. Thinking about from from a First Nation like Chesla's perspective, geez, how do we start to put together our multi-year financial plan? How do we start to think about a capital plan? Why do we want to start thinking about that sort of longer term planning? How can that support us to develop our infrastructure and to meet our community objectives? So Scott, if it's okay to turn over to you, and by way of introduction, everyone, Scott leads the standards and certification team for the First Nations Financial Management Board. And so he's very obviously familiar with things like multi-year financial plans and capital planning requirements. And sometimes in the abstract, these can seem like sort of, oh, geez, why are we doing this? But really it's to support, I think, your community to achieve those objectives. So thank you so much, Scott, for joining us today, and welcome.
Yep, thank you very much, Jason. And really appreciate the opportunity to present and offer some thoughts and perspectives on behalf of the FNB. I'm presenting today on the shared traditional unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations, and I'm delighted to be here today. On the topic of infrastructure, it occurs to me, I guess, that we're talking about projects that are large in scale. I mean, maybe not always, but I mean, we're probably all envisioning things like water treatment plants or sewage plants, as unglamorous as they are, or new community buildings or health centers. These are large projects that require a tremendous amount of partnership with a whole variety of other stakeholders that will be outside the community. It'll include the good folks at the First Nations Finance Authority, for example, from a lending and borrowing perspective. Maybe there will be other financial institutions that will be involved. There will be engineers and a whole variety of vendors that will be involved in the construction and development of infrastructure. Then once the infrastructure is up and running and built, there'll be expectations ongoing from the citizens that benefit from this infrastructure. And so what comes from that is a whole array of obligations that the First Nation is entering into. These are commitments and obligations, contractual obligations, and moral obligations to fulfill those expectations. So in a very basic level, a bank or a lending institution or a finance authority expects that they will be repaid the money that they lend on the terms that are agreed upon and over the time period that's agreed upon. Suppliers and vendors expect to be paid, of course, on the terms of the purchase and sale that they make. And citizens, most importantly, will have ongoing expectations that the assets will meet their needs, that they will meet the needs that were agreed upon and expected, and that the assets will be maintained in a way that the service standards remain high and at an acceptable level, and that over time assets are refurbished, replenished, maybe even rebuilt or replaced. So there's a tremendous amount of risk to that. And it's from the perspective of the FNB, there has to be an effective risk management strategy that the nation has in place and which is operational before entering into these sorts of large projects, because of the in the absence of that, things could go tremendously wrong, and unfortunately we might have some of those examples in mind, or where we've observed where things did not work out, and when they don't work out at the scale that we're talking about, it can be disastrous. So what I thought about when I was thinking about today's session from the FNB's perspective, we like to think that we have standards that help a nation establish a good risk management strategy and put in place some operational controls that allow for risk to be managed appropriately and for decisions to be made by the right people in the organization with enough capabilities to protect the interests of the nation and to ensure that infrastructure, for example, is delivered on time, on budget. Wouldn't that be a nice, you don't hear about too many infrastructure projects, at least in other levels of government, maybe doing those things always, but that should be the goal. And of course, the expectation that these assets deliver the service and deliver the benefit to the community that everyone hopes and is looking for. So from the FMB's perspective, we offer a variety of standards that deal certainly in part relating to infrastructure delivery, and really emphasize the need for long-term planning and the need for multi-year financial forecasting, for example. And these are concepts that sometimes may not exist and need to be developed. And we have people, of course, that are committed to helping nations and partnering with nations to start on the journey of developing those capabilities and capacity. And knowing that there might be instances where you need to look outside for specialized advice or support at times. But the concept of long-range planning, strategic planning, and multi-year financial modeling and forecasting, I think are essential. And you'll see those reflected in the standards that the FMB has. So we offer a financial management system certificate or certification. And what that certification is meant to represent is, or it provides the nation with the opportunity to demonstrate to those stakeholders I was mentioning, the citizens of the nation probably being most important to that, that the nation has met the FMB standards in this area, but in many others as well. So our terminology is using, we call it a financial management system, and it's meant to be all encompassing around the financial practices and the financial administration and financial governance, if you will. And it provides confidence, because that's ultimately what those people are, the individuals I was referring to are looking for. They're looking for confidence in the nation. And that confidence can be expressed by getting an independent body such as the FMB to review the practices, review the procedures, and determine whether the standards have been met. And if they are, then the FMB can issue a certificate, an independent certification to that effect, which can demonstrate that confidence. We have we have issued that type of certification to almost 50 nations now across the country, in all areas of this country. And so there's more and more nations that are seeing the value in that. And we also recognize it's hard work to get there in many cases. So we're developing new ways and piloting new techniques to build up that capacity, even for smaller nations that will find that difficult to have the structures that are in place. So I thought that would be a starting point, Jason, that hopefully others can also pick up on. Be delighted to answer questions or share more specifics about some of the standards that I'm referring to, or other aspects of our work. But I guess I'll end by saying I would really encourage nations that are embarking on an infrastructure journey to really think about whether they have the practices in place, the procedures in place to support that risk management approach I was referring to. And we'd be delighted to partner with you to look at that and to help develop that. So Jason, I'll turn it back to you at this point. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Scott. And what I heard you saying a lot is, geez, these projects can be big, they can be complex, they can take some time. And so if you're gonna embark on this journey of developing an infrastructure project, you might want to take in advance some time to set up the financial management systems, because you're going to need to track who you're going to, how you're going to manage the money, the funding that you have, the financing that you may get, the contractors that you may need to pay. There may be multiple people. It's going to have to go over multiple years potentially. You want to have a system in place. We know that elections can come and go, and there may be changes there. And so we want to have a good system in place that can withstand that. So when like you say, when members say, well, what's going on with this project, you're able to really have the information you need to give your members confidence, to give your lenders confidence, to give their business partners confidence that this project is proceeding in a good way. So, and I know there's lots of details around that, and I really thank you for those comments. I know I've been just checking into the chat box here, and thanks, Carol, for your note about thinking through your lands coordinator at Comox, and glad to see you here today, thinking about economic development activities. And we certainly, I think, have thought a lot about that, you know, in terms of nations that are using the First Nations Fiscal Management Act. Oftentimes there are economic development projects. And I know Trenton, I'm going to introduce Trenton in a minute here to say a few words about this, but sometimes it's hard to know where to get started with these projects and where to get started with the, you know, with an infrastructure, not only the economic development project, but do you have to have the infrastructure in place first, or do you have to get the lease signed first, or how does this all work? And I find sometimes it's really helpful to just think through examples and look at what has another nation done. And I know Trenton and Jody and Scott have lots of examples of here too, but one example that jumps out at me, Trenton, is that Akiskanak example that we've talked about. But I do want to introduce Trenton again. Trenton's with the First Nation Tax Commission. He is the director of policy and law review there, and he's coming to us today from Secwepemc territory in Kamloops, BC. We're really happy to have Trenton, and thanks for making time today. And wonder if you might have a few words just about thinking through how can nations generate revenues to pay for projects, and also do you have any examples that you might be able to share with us that might be helpful?
Yes, thanks, Jason, and thanks everybody for attending this. It's really great to see. I've been with the Tax Commission for a number of years, before when it was called the Indian Taxation Advisory Board, and I had somewhat of a role in working on sort of on this legislation that supports all of these institutions a long time ago. So it's certainly great to see where we've come since 15, 16 years ago. Thank you, Jason, also for acknowledging the territory of which I live and work at, the Kamloops. And it's I've ever since I came to this area, this is where I've lived on reserve here. And I've been fortunate to work with a very inspirational person by the name of Manny Jules, who is our chief commissioner. And it's really, I should start with that it's really been the vision of the Indian Taxation Advisory Board, and now with the Tax Commission, about showing and telling people about the linkages between community well-being and having a strong fiscal framework to support revenue raising. There's the sort of the economic benefits of projects, but there's the fiscal benefits, and we're all about maximizing those fiscal benefits. And the legislation reflects that. It reflects basically building infrastructure to attract investors, because investors, as you say, Jason, they want confidence, they want certainty, they want confidence in good, healthy infrastructure to support business, to support households. In this community, there's probably about 1,400 units in the Sun Rivers residential development, and they come because there's certainty, and that's because there's strong infrastructure. The tools that in the FMA with respect to revenue that the Tax Commission works with First Nations with are there are several actually, and property tax is what we typically see as people first think of taxation. They think of property tax, and of course, with property tax, you can use that money to put into a capital reserve over the long term to basically to save money to pay for infrastructure. And of course, you can use property taxes as well to finance through the Finance Authority, through local revenue, to venture financing. to finance your project. And there's also specific powers, development cost charge power and the service tax power to actually pay for the cost of capital infrastructure. And of course, we also have service fees, which essentially pay for the O&M associated with services, whether it be water, sewer, or garbage collection, and or waste removal and things of that sort. I'm glad you mentioned Kiskanook. That is an example I think is a really good one, because it shows it was really brought on by the taxpayers there. There was about 100 taxpayers in the Kiskanook. Kiskanook is in the, for those who don't know, it's in the sort of the Kootenay area, just I believe north of Invermere, in that area. And so they had some cottages, or some are, I think they're all year round actually, when I think about it. There were about 100 of them, and they needed they wanted a water main going through their community so that they could have, again, sort of reliable infrastructure and water for them. And they recognized that that would help with their property values, that their values of the property would increase over the long term. So they got together and they brought this to the attention of the community, the council, and they basically worked it out where they would use a service tax. And for those who don't know what a service tax, it's called the frontage tax, local improvement tax, a parcel tax. Essentially, it's a tax based on benefiter pays principle. So those who benefit from the infrastructure pay for the cost of it, and the cost of it is spread out amongst the, in this case, was the 100 units that benefited from the water project, and they pay over a long-term period, say 20 years. You can commute that cost to over, like you pay it sort of a lump sum, but typically it's over a long term and it runs with the property. But another aspect of it is that they went to the FNFA to finance that project. So essentially they created infrastructure that benefited their investors, which was these residential homeowners. And they did it through the taxpayers themselves paid for the cost of the infrastructure. And so that's like an excellent example of how this legislation works and can work for other communities who are interested. The other example that I talk about is that was most recently brought up in at the national meeting, leading the way, was the Tecumseh project for the water reservoir, where it was funded largely by the development cost charges funds that have been collected over the years by Tecumseh, and they pooled those resources to pay for the cost of this reservoir project, which was critical for continued investment on the lands in that particular area of the reserve. But it's another example of these fiscal powers that other governments take for granted, like debenture financing that the FNFA does, take for granted that they're actually working for these communities. And we certainly are prepared and willing to work with any community across the country to use these revenues to help them either build infrastructure or enhance the infrastructure that they have.
That's great, Trenton. Thank you so much for those comments. And we've heard now from Jody talking about how the Finance Authority can make loans for infrastructure projects. We've heard from Scott about establishing a good financial management system to keep track of these costs with these more complex projects over time. And we've heard from Trenton about generating revenue to repay loans to cover the costs, could be the operation and maintenance costs as well. I just want to maybe touch for a couple of minutes, just a little bit more about the role of the First Nation Infrastructure Institute. And then I'm going to put up just a sample sort of illustrative scenario about funding a project. And maybe that will spur some more conversation. I really, such great comments in the chat box so far. And I see Rose has joined us. I know Barb's here. And Carol, we got examples of actual, projects that communities have in mind. I think it'd be really interesting to think through some of these projects. But the idea behind Finney is again to be complementary to the services of the other 3 institutes, and really to work. I sort of think of it as bringing a bit more bench strength to a project team, working alongside, not to replace, really to work alongside, supporting nations on a project team to develop the project, to support knowledge transfer, and to deliver the project on time and on budget. We know these projects, like Scott said, they can be larger and more complex. They will have a longer life cycle. So you may, you're not going to do hopefully 5 water plants, in your lifetime. Hopefully there's going to be 1 that's done, and then that lasts for a long time. But the drawback of that is you may not have a lot of experience doing these, and so having some support can be helpful. I've got a illustrative scenario here that I know this is a bit of a busy slide, but I think it's maybe helpful just to think through a little bit. One scenario, again, there could be many different scenarios, I think, but in this picture we can see in the middle of the slide is the First Nation, in this case a single First Nation. They have an infrastructure project in mind. Could be water project, could be wastewater, could be health center. Like I think there's been many suggestions. Could be economic development project. In order to do that project, they need to pay for the capital costs. And when we say capital costs, another way to think of that is maybe the construction costs of building the project initially. And in order to pay for that, we have on the left-hand side some different revenues that could be possible that a nation could have. Certainly there could be some transfer money from ISK or other parts of the federal government or other governments. Maybe there's some provincial funding. There could be some local revenue. Those are the things that Trenton was talking about. There could be some other revenues. Again, that could be, maybe there's an impact benefit agreement the nation has, or some other types of revenues that they want to bring to bear. And they could use those revenues to work with the First Nations Finance Authority to get a loan for the project. In order to qualify for the loan for the project, the nation would work with the Financial Management Board to have a certificate to make sure you have the systems in place to manage the finances associated with your financial management system, and to use some tax laws to generate revenue to be able to finance the loan. In addition, what we're seeing in this scenario is the First Nation Infrastructure Institute providing some support in developing your project plan. That's bringing your project team members together, developing some roles and responsibilities for the team about how you're going to work together, developing your business case, which could include things like, your strategic case. Why are you doing the project? The economic case, developing some indicative costs, doing a feasibility study, for example, doing the commercial case, which is thinking about how you're going to reach out to find a partner potentially to work with, and how you're going to manage risks through procurement, developing a whole of life financial plan for the project, and last but not least, the management case. How are you going to manage the project on an ongoing basis? So that's the idea for this. Maybe just as a bit of a scenario, we do have another picture here, and that's because we really want to think about the whole of life costs. And so this looks similar to the last one, but in this case, we're thinking about the ongoing operation and maintenance costs of the project. So again, there could be different revenue streams that you use. We wouldn't anticipate necessarily a loan in the ongoing operation and maintenance, but there could be collection of revenues on an ongoing basis. This is really important, we think, to make sure your asset's going to last for its expected life cycle. So I'll stop sharing the screen there and come back and see if I see Jody's been asking people if they have any projects they're working on. I really enjoyed, I know Trenton's mentioned the National Leading the Way conference, and if you have a chance, if you weren't able to attend, I think they're going to have up on the website shortly some video clips from it. It's fnleadingtheway.ca.com. Someone will correct me. Davis will put the link hopefully in the chat box there for people to click on. But Jody hosted a really interesting panel. They're talking to some different First Nations about projects they had. I was fascinated by the community center and elders center there, Jody, and some other ones. I don't know if there's some of those examples you might be able to reflect on.
Yeah, absolutely, Jason. And just interesting points really being brought up in terms of, what is infrastructure? Are we talking about, billion-dollar energy projects, or are we talking about million-dollar infrastructure within the community, like the pipes and the roads and all of those things? And really all of that is infrastructure. Some of the infrastructure creates revenue as a result of building it, and some of it doesn't. But if we talk about even housing, for example, and if you want to bring more homes, we know there's a housing shortage. Well, we can't just build homes without having running water or electrification or all these types of things that are important. And when we start to build these green fields and start to develop these green fields, what happens is there's a trickle effect. And so people want to end up coming home because we have beautiful homes, and businesses want and are attracted to the reserves back into our communities because we have the infrastructure in place. And some of the things that, we've done so many projects at this point, and Jason, I know you're talking about the Temagami project, which was extraordinary. And this is a very small First Nation that's located in Northern Ontario. It's a remote First Nation, and it's located on an island. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to build a brand new multi-use facility. So they wanted a building that housed their governance and administration, but they also wanted a gathering place for their community. So they built a multi-use facility where they could have community gatherings that has an industrial sized kitchen in it, and a place for the youth to come. This was a gathering place, obviously, during the day because it housed the governance and administration. This is where Chief and Council comes to make all of the decisions for the community. And in the evening, it was being used again as whatever, cultural center, daycares, you name it. And then what they ended up building next to it was a 10-unit elders facility, or elders home, which they never had anywhere for their elders to come back to. And so this was the one thing that they wanted to take care of their elders and give them a place to live. And so they were able to do that and build a beautiful elders complex that is accessible. It's right next door to the community gathering place, and it overlooks their traditional territory of Lake Temagami. It's just outstanding. But this is a project that has been on their books for years. And finally, they said, how are we going to finance this project? We're not getting the funding that we have asked for year after year after year. So what they did is they looked at their existing own source revenue, and they approached the First Nations Finance Authority for funding for these projects. And with their existing revenue streams, we were able to leverage that and give them buying power to complete those two projects. And then we also see other types of projects that are economic development projects, like the Clearwater project that has been really in the news a lot lately, which has impacted both large and small communities and was an extraordinary power move on behalf of the Mi'kmaq Nation. These are really big game-changing projects that we're talking about, seeing across the country. And the comment was made, do you get the leases in place before you build it, or are you approaching it like we're going to build it and they will come? These are all types of questions that everybody asks. And one of the great benefits of working and being a member of the First Nations Finance Authority is that we can go and say, hey, Carol, that project that you guys are looking at, well, Tamagami First Nation just finished a project exactly like it. So let us link you with that community, and they can tell you what they learned throughout the duration of that particular process, what they would do differently next time. Because a lot of times, and what happens in our communities is that we're just like, hey, Jason, you're on this project today, get it done. And then often we're going, where do we start? So now that we have these tools in place and we have these support systems in place that can help you, that you have somewhere to reach out to and say, where do I start with this? When you're considering procurement, are you looking at job creation? And who were you working with? The contractors Scott mentioned earlier. These guys, are they bidding on your project? How do you create an RFP for your project? What is a good price for these types of things? And what are reasonable rates and returns of income on these, if there is any at all? So there is a lot to consider, but understand that there's people out there that have gone through similar situations, and that can help you for sure. And there's a lot of success that can happen as a result. And earlier I was talking about housing, and there was one First Nation that we worked with, and we built 55 homes in 1 year on that First Nation. And that was a massive, massive project, but it also stimulated the surrounding economies, because what happens is there's a ton of job creation that happens as a result of a project of that size. And if you bring 55 homes onto a First Nation, all of a sudden you need 55 stoves and 55 refrigerators and 55 washers and dryers, which is really starting to impact the surrounding areas. So there's a lot of great things that, I can go on and talk about a number of projects. And, this year we did a large energy project in Henby Inlet First Nation. And that First Nation is a very, very tiny First Nation, and it's truly a rags to riches story, where they partnered with a large energy company to become a 50% owner in a 300 megawatt wind farm. So now part of their reserve, which was uninhabited before and still is now generating multi-million-dollar revenue streams for their communities. It's creating jobs, and again, it's a game changer. But had those communities just sat and waited for Indian Affairs or INAC to provide the funding, this wouldn't have happened. So First Nations are saying, we're not waiting anymore. We're going on with these projects, and we're going to find ways to finance it. And our job is to ensure that we can provide financing at the best possible rates with the best possible terms.
That is a great note to sort of conclude on, Jody, and I think so powerful that that message of asserting our jurisdiction, nations moving ahead, doing things that are aligned with their priorities, not necessarily priorities of someone else, and using the tools of the FNFA and being able to get loans for projects that meet community priorities is such a powerful story. I see Carol had asked a really good question in the chat box about how do you start doing a bit of work, thinking through an idea, thinking about the feasibility of a project, before you start getting into the point of, well, I need a loan. How do we even know how much we need a loan for? What is the project? Who is it going to serve? What are the objectives of it? What challenges is it addressing? And certainly that's something, Carol, that we've thought a lot about at the First Nation Infrastructure Institute. In fact, we have been doing a project, a water and wastewater project with a community, and we spent a fair amount of time thinking through, even like before we get to the feasibility study, describing what it is that we want to study. So for example, what are it is a wastewater issue. What are the technology options that could be possible? We want to study those technology options. We want to think about the location potentially of where the plant could go. We want to think about who's going to get connected to the system, and we want to study these different things, and we want to study the costs of them and the feasibility of doing them through some work. And so, even thinking through describing what it is that you'd like to study, and then also seeking a, if it's not something you're able to do that work yourself internally, you may want to reach out to some different firms to help you with that work. For example, could be an engineering firm or a planning firm, and say, can you help us with this work? But when you reach out to find a company to do that work, you may want to think about the different reasons you're going to partner with them to do that work. Are they going to have, is it going to be the lowest cost bid? Is that the one defining characteristic? Are there other aspects of the work that you might think are important? Do you want to have some of your community members participate, for example? Are there other criteria that you might you want to understand the experience and qualifications, of course, the people helping you with the work, and maybe in particular, who specifically out of the firm is going to be working on the project with you? Is it going to be very junior people? Are they going to have some more senior people with experience? Are they going to have people who have experience with Indigenous projects and specific issues with respect to Indigenous projects? These are all really great questions and things to think about when you're doing your feasibility study. I see John Dumbrell is on the line with us today. And John, I don't know if John's been working with us at the First Nation Infrastructure Institute. I don't want to put you on the spot, John, but this question seems kind of right up your alley. Would you have a few words to say about it?
Well, thank you, Jason. Good morning, everyone. Coming to you this morning from Secwepemc territory in Kamloops. And Jason, I think you captured it really well, but essentially on the feasibility study, really founded on some of the earlier objectives that have been set by the community, many of which have been discussed this morning. Things such as, provision of clean water. In the case of the example that Jason referred to here, which is the Kettle and Stony Point community in Ontario. In that case, it's not just providing clean water, but being a wastewater project, protecting the environment and protecting public health. And so setting the objectives of the project and then moving on into the feasibility study that, as Jason described, looked at the different ways of addressing those challenges of the community, making sure that members are well protected in terms of public health and proper treatment of wastewater. And then also in that case, very much an economic development dimension to it as well, because there are roughly 500 lease lots which are on the lands of the community. And so looking at the feasibility of providing in a technological way, in a very financially sound way, both from capital and operating costs, the technology that's required to address those challenges, those basic challenges of public health and environmental integrity. So yeah, so Jason, thank you. And everyone, thank you so much for the chance to comment on that.
That process has been really interesting of working through these steps, thinking through, okay, well, we know there's a problem with the current system. We need to study and do a feasibility work on what a new system could look like and how much it could cost. Now we have to develop a financial plan. We need to figure out how are we going to afford this? How is it going to fit in? And do we have a multi-year financial plan? And that's really, I think, where a lot of the standards of the FMB, and Scott, if it's okay to turn back to you, is sort of thinking through this process. Okay, well, now we have some costs here. How do we fit this into our plans? And what experience or advice would you have, I guess, of seeing communities work through this challenge?
Yeah, thank you, Jason. Absolutely. I mean, it's all about process, and it's not a glamorous word to use, and it can bore people to death talking about process, but we're talking about the policies and the procedures that will guide the decision making in these areas. That's really what we're talking about. So have you taken the time to think of the steps that you need to go through to reach the best decision possible? Knowing that you won't always have perfect information, you won't have all the information available to reach that decision, so there'll still be uncertainties, but it's managing the risk of those uncertainties. So getting going through the right amount of rigor to determine what the right scale and scope of the project is, and balancing that with the financial aspects of it and what's possible. So I think one important aspect of that structure is having what we, under our FMS standards, we call the Finance and Audit Committee. and a nation may choose to use a different term to refer to that committee, but the concept being this is a committee that's meant to support council. They're not there to make the final decision. That's ultimately the elected leaders and the council, chief and council to do that, but it's to inform council, and maybe it's to develop some specialized expertise, to bring in specialists that have that deep technical knowledge to give advice to the committee. But ultimately it's for the committee to act in the interests of the nation, to provide the best informed advice they can. One of the important aspects we feel is really important is that members of that committee are independent of the nation, so that there's no financial conflict of interest, for example, that sometimes could be there, or that there's no, there's not a so that the members on this committee are free to deliberate and provide whatever they feel in their judgment is the best decision. And you can only do that really when you're objective and truly objective in your decision making, and that's the meaning sort of independence that I'm referring to. So that, that's a matter of fact and circumstance, and realizing that every nation might have a slightly different perspective on how that's achieved. But really, you want to have a body like that, and maybe there's other committees that need to be created in a similar form. Maybe there needs to be a technical infrastructure project committee established to guide, kind of as a steering committee, to guide the decision-making through the life of the project, for example. So there's some other ways that you can achieve that. But I think from the FMB's perspective, having that specialized knowledge available, and not saying it has to be all developed in-house. You might not have, engineers that you can draw from within your community. Maybe you have to go outside your community to get some of that expertise. That's fine, but at least it's a committee that has that function and is given that responsibility to go find the right people to gain that knowledge. So that's one aspect. I think that back to my earlier comments about risk management, it fits in with that, and I think it certainly complements the decision-making process that we've been talking about. I hope that helps.
That's really great, Scott. And we're sort of building the story here of this project. We're thinking about a need in the community. We're thinking about doing some feasibility work to figure out the costs of it. We're thinking about talking to Jody about getting a loan. We're then saying, oh, well, we should put a good process in place so we can do this work in a good way, assign some roles and responsibilities, and talking to Scott and the FMB, making sure we have a financial plan. Sometimes these costs of these projects that we've mentioned, they're big projects, and we get the feasibility study done, and it's like, holy cow, that seems like a lot of money. We can't, there's no way we can, how are we going to afford this, right? But the amazing part to me about the Fiscal Management Act and the tools, and maybe Trenton can speak a little bit to this, is if you spread the costs over a long period of time, because this project is going to last a long time, then maybe it's actually more affordable than you think. And so the tax laws that you can pass, the local revenue laws, create that ability, I think, to spread the costs over a period of time. And it's maybe surprising. Well, it's not surprising, but it's also impressive, I think, the amount of tax revenue that nations are collecting right now and how they could use that towards some of the infrastructure projects. So Trenton, I don't know if you'd be willing to say just a little bit about the nations that are out there collecting local revenues and in different ways, whether it's service taxes or property taxes or development cost charges, and how they're able to spread that cost over time. Oh, you're on mute there, Trenton.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, I again, as you say, there are ways to, I guess, spread the cost of what very expensive projects over time, and of course we also encourage First Nations just basically because is to save, right, to use capital reserves. We know, for example, the property transfer tax is a very popular tax for First Nations at the moment. We have First Nations in various provinces who are establishing these funds, and these funds, these typically a property transfer tax is over and above. Well, it is not typically; it's always over and above general property tax. So there's really no service requirements associated with them. So it's pretty flexible in terms of how First Nations. So we do encourage First Nations that have property transfer taxes to put those monies into reserve funds or use them to finance debt to for if they have infrastructure requirements, and most all of them do. We did talk about the Akuskanuk, which is the service tax, and the service tax, as I said, is designed most of the time to deal with capital infrastructure, whether it be a road or a water main, a sewer line, and it is spread out over the 20-year period. And again, like with the Akuskanuk, we think it's a natural fit with the finance authority in terms of how instead of, because most governments, when they have a service tax, they would front end the cost of the infrastructure. In this case, they're basically using basically the taxpayers are paying for the cost of it over time, and certainly that's an affordable way to get infrastructure. And development cost charges another way where in that case it's the developer who's imposing new capital burdens in the community, and the charge is designed to address those either through improving the infrastructure for enhanced capacity or enlarging it. But essentially it is typically a long-term, because the money is put in a capital reserve. And when the sufficient resources in those reserve funds to do the capital project that's in that particular DCC class, then they will initiate it. But it is a sort of a long-term. And I think with financing, that's another way of addressing infrastructure needs, but you do it over a long term. I mean, the FNFA has been quite successful in demonstrating that and paying for those. So with the various revenue under the fiscal management act, the different fiscal powers, those are all, and we encourage First Nations. And that's one thing we really want to stress upon First Nations. I know I can see some taxing First Nations are here at this video conference, and certainly want to encourage more to access these revenue raising powers. And even if the revenue is not a heck of a lot at the moment, we believe, obviously, to set up that infrastructure now, because over time it will come. I always point to the community in near Chilliwack, Skiala, which when they first joined when they started first establishing the tax jurisdiction, I think they were generating around $3,000 or $4,000 a year, largely, I believe, from utility property on their lands. But then they developed Eagles Landing, and which has been quite successful. Now they're generating probably 1.5 million in taxation through that infrastructure. So it's essentially, and I think we would encourage all First Nations to set up their jurisdiction and their laws to support this, to support these revenues. And I think over time, you'll see the results. And I think I've seen it time and time again. You talk about, Jody talks about the various infrastructure projects, and she talked about how some of it is economic development related and some of it is community related. And I've seen that. I mean, in this community here at Tecumseh, they used local revenue to pay for the cost of their powwow arbor, which is, if anybody who's been up this way, they know it's a magnificent facility. A place to be. And other communities have built with their local revenue, have built elders lodges and community centers, or bought or built fire halls through their capital reserves. So it is it is, all these tools are for First Nations to use and to establish, and we certainly encourage them to do so.
Thanks so much, Trenton. The great examples, and yeah, that's bringing I think bringing things together here, saying, well, really it's to support a more sustainable infrastructure approach for the entire community, and developing some areas, like you say, maybe there's some areas that are developed for economic development, but you're using the tax laws and the tools of the Fiscal Management Act to raise revenues to improve your overall infrastructure system. And I know Rose is on the line here. Rose, I wonder if you might be willing to say a few words about Buckinghamshire, about your community and the work that you've been doing, because I think it's a pretty interesting story about the developments that you have been doing and how you're thinking about long term. Is really interesting to me, bringing all these different tools to bear. Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot here. Hopefully that's okay. I see you've taken mute off, but okay. Well, Rose may join us, but I see. Oh, I see you're typing, but I can't hear you actually, Rose.
Yeah, she doesn't have a mic or
camera.
camera.
Okay. Okay. So, Daryl, you're joining us though. Did you want to say a few words about the work that you're doing and the tools that you're using of the Fiscal Management Act? Okay, Daryl's not gonna. Anyways, that we have been talking a little bit to Buckinghamshire. They are using the tools of the Fiscal Management Act, and I think thinking in this way, Trenton, like you're talking about, which is how can we use the tools? How can we use the tools to develop infrastructure that will support both some economic development opportunities, which provides employment opportunities for our members, but also improves the infrastructure for the future growth of our community. And that's the real exciting part, I think, to me, of thinking about these plans. But as we've said, it takes a bit of planning to think through these plans. They are complex. They can take a number of years, and to put the plan together. That's really what the First Nation Infrastructure Institute is really about, is supporting nations that are interested in developing that infrastructure plan. So I know we're coming close to the end of our time here, and I wonder with our panelists or anyone else who would like to speak, really, just to give an opportunity for you to have a few concluding comments. Maybe I can go to Jody first, and then to Scott, and then to Trenton, and then if there's anyone else that would like to have a few comments, please feel free. Jody?
Thanks, Jason, and it's nice to see some people from the East here as well. Rose and Daryl, hello. My final thoughts on this is start the process. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes a while, but it speaks volumes in terms of building governance and strengthening your systems within your community. So even if you don't plan to borrow this year or next year, still start the process now, because it'll put you in a position that when you do need to move, or when you do need to finance a project, and sometimes these things sneak up quite quickly, that you're better positioned to move on them right away. So there are some fantastic tools, and you can use those within your communities to just strengthen policies and processes. It doesn't mean that you have to work with the FNFA. It doesn't mean that you have to work with the FNTC, but the FNB has some fantastic tools that will only create strength and better position you from an investor standpoint, or people that are wanting to invest in the community. So reach out to us. We're happy to share stories. And again, Jason and my other panelists, thank you very much, and to all the participants, thank you.
Yeah, Jody, sorry we weren't on the call earlier, but yes, we are through the process of FNFNB. So we started way back when Frank Bush was on, and a few other staff through FNFA. We went through the certification process, so we are now in the process of this September past, we got certified, so we got our certificate. So we have 2 loans now. We have the the infrastructure for Bayside, which Rose, our CEO with DevCorp, is leading. And the other portion is through the recent First Nations Coalition for the Clearwater. So you've gone through 2 FNFA loans already. And then, yeah, like Jason was saying, we've got other projects on the go. Rose is working on those other plans as relates to ATR and other areas as far as economic development and other lands and what the land use process would be. So yeah, it's been a great process. We are now just going through capacity development with First Nations Finance Management Board through our rep, Nathan Sack. So this will be the after our first assessment. So we're just getting to that stage of fine tuning our other areas as far as the internal capacity. And yeah, so I believe the FNFA loans has given us that great opportunity and financing that we otherwise wouldn't have had through this certification process.
Such a great story, Daryl. Thanks for sharing that with us today. And Scott, this is a great segue to from talking about access to capital and improved financial management.
Yeah, and it's wonderful to hear those real life stories of how the institutions and the FMA are being used to benefit nations and to fulfill these long standing needs, especially from an infrastructure perspective and from an economic development perspective. So that's just tremendous to hear. Yeah, and I think it has to be said that the work here at the FMB is we invite nations to look at what services they might benefit from. We of course continue to work on a voluntary basis, and it's entirely optional to work with us at the FMB. So there's no downside to speaking with us and finding out if there are some services that we could offer you at no cost. We don't charge for our services. So if there's if we can support your community to work towards certification, or even if it's just some advice and some reviews that you would like us to help you with as part of your project, that's probably something we can also accommodate. So yeah, so I think the earlier comments I think covered the main bulk of what I wanted to share around encouraging people to think long term, because that's sometimes a new thing to do from a financial perspective. Not always. A lot of nations have always had a history of doing that, but some maybe are embarking on some of these longer term projects maybe for the first time on their own terms, and managing them and pushing forward on their own terms rather than relying on others to maybe do that. So yeah, my comment in the chat box was around life cycle planning and the need to really develop skill sets in that area. It's a whole field of practice, I realize, and I'm really excited about Finney coming online, because I think they'll become a great resource to support nations from a life cycle planning perspective, and they'll be able to provide that really deep level of expertise, I think, that nations will benefit from and be able to draw from. So it's things like thinking about, how do I fund the eventual replacement of this new building? It's costing a lot of money now, but it's like everything, nothing lasts forever. So how am I going to actually put money aside over time to, pay for its eventual replacement or repair? So I think some of those comments or some of those ideas were the ones I wanted to make sure we covered today. So thank you for the opportunity, Jason.
Oh, thank you, Scott. That's very, very helpful. And we'll turn to Trenton for some final words.
Thanks again, Scott, Jason, for inviting the Tax Commission. For being part of this meeting, and certainly what we wanted to convey to all the attendees and those who are watching, that establishing your complete fiscal framework is essential for a long-term economic well-being. That as the examples that I had discussed earlier with communities who started out with very modest tax bases have over time have developed into more sort of larger and more comprehensive tax bases. And we've seen this success time and time again across the country. And we see a strong connection for economic well-being for communities with the level of sound infrastructure that they have. And we also believe that having the fiscal framework to support that infrastructure is essential. And again, thank you. And thanks to be a part of all of this. Thank you.
Thanks, Trenton. So I think that brings us to the conclusion. Before we wrap up, just a few last points. If you wanted to check out the previous webinars, you can head over to fnii.ca, and there's some videos there. There's also some resources actually that you might find helpful. There's a project charter template, there's a business case template, there's a procurement backgrounder, there's a cost sharing explainer. Yeah, feel free to check some of those out. If you have questions about any of those things, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can get us by email at info@fini.ca. And if you think that Fini is something that your nation would support, or think that's something that should be established, we would really appreciate your support. And there is on the About Us section, a Support Fini button there, where there's a Fini 101 deck, a presentation, a Fini 101 briefing note, and a draft letter of support. So we would really appreciate your support. So thanks to each and every one of you for attending today. And we'll just wrap up and pass it back to Alan Claxton, our Development Board Chair, to close us in a good way.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you to all the speakers today. Wonderful words. Thank you to all the participants. Very exciting moving forward. I was very fortunate that early in my years as chief, I met Manny Jules and worked with him for all the years I was chief, and met a lot of good people that helped my nation move forward. They were all the institutions were always there for me as chief, and I always appreciated that. And they're still there today. And what a great thing to look forward to is when Fini becomes a reality. Want to also talk about at the beginning of the meeting where we were talking about where were we a year ago. And for all that time from a year ago to 3 years ago, it was always Jason and I somewhere on the road in Eastern Canada or Kamloops or what have you. And thinking from this past year of what we've all been through. And now we're almost through it, but we still have to be very careful and not open up too quickly, because we don't want to go through this again. We want to end this and get back to what we had before, so we can see each other and work closely together and continue to move forward. So it was a wonderful meeting today. So everyone continue to be safe. Give a shout out to someone in need today, and let's keep in touch by Zoom in the time being. And thank you very much, and stay safe. Love you guys.